right, so this is C-Suite Standards, a show where I sit down with the leaders across completely different industries and pull apart how they actually think. Aviation is our first season because it's where I live and where I think the sharpest lessons in leadership, risk, and human performance are hiding in plain sight. Today's guest spent close to a decade as a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper sensor operator and instructor. Thousands of hours, over 1,000 missions, and has spent the years since studying what the job actually does to the people who do it. He now teaches the next generation of UAS operators at the University of North Dakota and runs Remote Warrior, an advocacy organization for the operators who came before them. Tanner Yackley, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much, Blake. So happy to be here.
Perfect. So before anything heavy, how'd you end up in the seat in the first place? What did 18-year-old you think when you were signing up for?
Yeah, man, it was, 18 years old. I was growing up in Minnesota at the time, which you don't ever hear until I say the word Minnesota. It's one of the weirdest accents to have ever, because you can completely hide it for 90% of a conversation. But grew up there, wasn't a lot to do. It was farm country, right? It was a lot of, blue collar, things like that. I just wanted to do something different. And at the time, I had no desire to go to college, which is hilarious because I went on to teach as a professor, as you mentioned, there, and it's like, looking back, my 18-year-old self, and I'm like, what the heck? How'd you get there? But no, just decided to join the military because my only other option was, either dig a trench or, or go in the military, since college was out of the option at the time. But yeah, and then just saw this job come up. A recruiter talked to me about it and said, "Hey, there's this cool thing, on this aircraft, which is the one right there, that you're going to be controlling a camera and like watching over convoys and stuff." And 18-year-old me was like, "That sounds awesome," with it. So I jumped on and kind of signed on and jumped in feet first.
I'd say a badass career path.
Yeah.
Being able to see certain things that almost nobody else has the opportunity to.
Absolutely.
What do you think's been the coolest part of the mission so far for you?
One thing that we didn't realize, right, with this, and I reflect on this a lot, is how much, because I joined in 2010, was on my first combat mission, October of 11, there, and, I was 19 at the time, flying combat missions, and, you got a pilot in the left seat, you got my role, the sensor operator, in the right seat, and that's only to control the aircraft, right? I got a headset on that I'm getting just intel fed into my ear. Could be the mission commander saying, "Hey, there's weather in the area now," that kind of stuff. So you're just intaking all this information, right? So for the first year or two, it was just drinking from a fire hose, right? The classic military analogy with anything. So just trying to figure out, what this all is, right? And it wasn't easy. I had a lot of challenges throughout my training and things like that because it was just a ton of information with it, and it really evolved too, right? When I first started it, it was still kind of looked at as this new thing. I put the air quotes because even 15 years later, almost nobody understands what an RPA is, or everybody thinks of drones and they just think of the little small quadcopters buzzing around now, especially with everything going on in the world. They think of them as small there. So it was unique, right? And we didn't realize how much, honestly, we were paving the way for that field. Reaper came on board around 08, 07, 08 timeframe. Really, the ramp up was around 2012 there, and they went from something like 20 something combat air patrols to 60 something at the time. So the ramp up was brutal. But for us, it was just you just fly longer hours at that point, and so then it was instead of doing 2-3 hours on shift where you're doing that and you're dealing with additional duties and stuff like that around it, then it's all right, you're flying 6, 7, 8 hours every night with it. And our pilots got it worse because obviously that takes a little bit more time to train up a pilot. But even us, we went through probably a solid, you cut out all the weird pauses in training and shifting to different bases for training and stuff like that. It was about 18 months of training that they put into us for this job. So it was like I said, it was a lot of drinking from a fire hose. It was a lot of not understanding really what we were really a part of. Back then we didn't realize that. Oh my gosh, we're kind of quote unquote paving the way for RPAs. The previous 10 years they'd been used, right? They started getting used in even the 90s when the Predator came on board, which is the smaller one there on the bottom. You can always tell the difference. Pred's got the V-tail down, Reaper's got the V-tail up for it, and that's your kind of bigger or your best way to visually identify them, right? Predator technically got what's it called? Retired in 2018, but you still see a couple of them kicking around. The Army uses the Charlie variant, which is just a little bit different. They make little tweaks, things like that. Could be extend the wings out a little bit, right? Add extended range tanks, whatever it is. That's more on like the Reaper stuff, but yeah. So it's just a very unique thing to walk into, especially at 19, and have no understanding that what you're really getting into, right? So it was a lot of like figuring it out as we went, which for something that is just information overload in your face, right, all the time. And we had 8 screens that each person in the ground control station was, tied to essentially. There, and trying to understand, what all this information is. You're building in these constant cross checks, right, of where am I looking for information, right? We had even ways that we would set up. I mean, we almost created a standard for one of our just side computer screens for having, because we could have altitude stacks on there. We could have additional maps that would tell us where other aircraft were looking, where they were orbiting. So that way it made deconflicting and everything else a heck of a lot easier, because we're not having to worry about, I got to worry about, getting some type of alert or something like that. We had a lot of visual representations because you're sitting in a box and flying an aircraft there.
It puts communication to the test at all points, it seems.
Absolutely. Yep. The crew resource management piece to that was massive, with having to, deal with a lot of these different distributed systems, right? Because our launch and recovery crew would be downrange. We're sitting stateside. I got to deal with, maybe comm because there's a link issue, right, with it, and I got to know who to call for that, or the silly, stupid stuff, right? And I'm sure somebody will, Chair Force, and it's like if the screen broke, right, which is like doesn't seem like that big a deal, but I remember I had one time we were ramping up to pull the trigger on a target, and my screen went out, and it was literally just like, you just look over, like I literally looked over and was moving the crosshairs on the pilot screen on the left side around all these monitors, because like it's not like I can be like, all right, hold on, let me stop and troubleshoot this real quick. Like I'm about to turn a laser on to release a weapon. And I think with that one, they ended up getting into, really collateral high area. We were very, very strategic in when we took a shot and why we took a shot there, and making sure that things were, the collateral around it was free as it can be when you're looking through a bunch of soda straws, right, with that view.
Right on. I'm sure that's a very difficult job to be a part of.
Yeah.
Now, as you were saying that you kind of paved the way to have certain regards in this side of the industry, I'm curious what changed since you were inside of that work, inside of the institution, but also really the institutions outside of that haven't necessarily caught up to, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we opened up with, right? There's a lot of misconceptions around this thing. And for somebody that, for me, that's been in it for 16 years, it's a weird place to be, right? Because I can't just walk into an office building or walk into a doctor's office or walk into any event, right? A family barbecue, right? And start talking about it. Nobody gets it, right? Because it's one of those things that unless you sit there, and I don't mean just, you got your, 1 hour a quarter, right? All the leadership, with it, they'd come in and check their box for currency. I got to take a shot at them. But when you sat there, over and over and over again, your way of thinking kind of changes, right? With it, because you're always trying to think forward with the operation, right? I'm always trying to think of, right, I've got this limited view. I can't just pick my head up and look outside the aircraft, right? Like any other, if I go, completely spatially disorientated in a, manned aviation platform, I can at least pick my head up and go, all right, where am I at, right? Reaper, we didn't have that all the time, right? There's times where it's like, no, we've got, HVI, high value individual number one under the crosshairs. I don't care if the wings fall off, you're staying on this thing. You know, because that's part of the intelligence piece to this. And so that's the big piece that kind of evolved as we went along, right? Is you've got a bunch of distributed systems, you've got a bunch of information flows that are happening all over the place, right? And we were kind of that central piece to maintain it all, but also we had to act on all of that too. So we had to intake all these pieces. I had to intake, Intel telling me things in my ear, or figuring out things from the imagery and stuff like that, and going, ooh, wait, there's a choke point over here that they could, if all of a sudden we're following a convoy, and I realize that, ooh, there's a choke point coming up on the map, maybe I need to relay that down to them, right? And so it's that massive amount of information flow that is a funny thing to have seen that so many years ago, and now look at industries like AI. And as technology is advancing in general, what are we getting, right? We're getting all these systems with a bunch of information, right? The biggest problem in AI right now is data. There's too much of it. Nobody knows how to sort it, right? Nobody knows what to do with it. And so it really causes an issue for the people that are trying to navigate that, because they feel like they're trying to navigate it from square one, where a big part of my research and my work now is going, I think we already kind of solved a couple of those things, a couple of years back, because we were in this distributed system that we were kind of the linchpin in for taking in the data, figuring out what matters, what doesn't, right? What's just noise for it. And, it's things that they haven't caught up yet. And like you said, right, these systems, right, you've got, Air Force policy, right? If you look at every single study that's been done on drone operators, it's all occupational health issues, meaning it's all things that you can measure externally that they're trying to measure here, and it's missing the mark completely, unfortunately, because it's like, it's good things, right? I'm not on here to rip on all the, research that has been done, but I think there's a substantial gap, right? And so it's, being able to measure things like understanding, prediction, prioritization, right? Mental recovery, right? If I get a new piece of information, how do I recover, that previous mental model that I was maintaining, or how does that shift? And that's a lot of what, we dealt with. And from the operational side, right, just looking at like DoD, Air Force, and now, Army, Marines, everybody's using drones now, is things like the handoffs, right? Going from, if you're going to come in and replace me because the aircraft's been airborne for 10 hours, right, and then I've got to go home, right? I can't just sit there and keep operating for another 10, which is one lesson that a lot of aircraft manufacturers right now I don't think are taking into consideration, right? Is, oh, cool, I've got this platform that can operate for 20 plus hours. That's great. You're going to need at least 6 people to operate that thing, truthfully, right? You can run it with 2 to 3, but you're going to burn your crews out so fast.
The age of the system.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not being able to realize, like, oh yeah, this technology and different things are great, but if it's not, we've outpaced human cognition in this realm, almost, tenfold, right? Because we're ingesting all this data, and it's like, okay, that's great, but how do you make it, right? And how do you make it presentable? How do you make it executable, right? With being able to look at the different pieces of information, and it's different things like having chronic responsibility, right? When you get into like the mental health side of things, right? I always walked into a ground control station, right, which is about this 10 by 30 foot shipping container looking deal. Nice carpeted, padded walls. That always made me laugh. It was like, what the heck? But what people aren't realizing is you've essentially put somebody into a position that at any given second, they need to be prepared to take a life.
Sure.
And cognitively, I think that does something to you. We see it in other areas, right? We see it in nuclear reactor operators. We see it in, even 911 dispatchers, right? More and more is coming out there, which is a lot of why I do a lot of work with like law enforcement professionals, because they're getting all these drone for first responder programs, which is awesome, but they're going to get a bunch of tech just dropped in their lap and have no SOP, going forward on what do I do with this, information, and how do I correctly implement this. And so it's hard because it's, buy, more, drones, which is great. But when we're not looking at things, that understand the long exposure, right? And sitting there, right? Because everyone thinks like, oh, there was nights where I would walk into a ground control station, the sensor would be sitting there, we'd talk about, all right, try to do this context passing, right, of what they know versus what I've been briefed of the general overview. And then I got to try to marry that together and make sure I don't lose any details. But I might not know that, oh, by the way, 4 hours ago, the vehicle stopped this super important place that maybe wasn't important at that time, right? But if they hit it again, then it becomes important. But if I don't hold that mental model and I don't understand where that vehicle was 6 hours before, then I'm not going to be able to correctly make that decision, right? It has nothing to do with my ability to understand the tactics, understand the ROE, understand the special instructions, how the ground control station works, how the payload works, any of it. It has everything to do with me being able to not reconstruct context from a previous operator correctly to be able to make that decision. And I think that piece right there is one of the biggest things that AI and technology is. I don't think they've necessarily put words to it yet, but it's kind of this friction point that we keep seeing, with these different things. Even with Anduril, with Shield AI, with Palantir, right? You got three of your biggest names in AI defense contracting there. I'll be really curious to see, where they end up with those thought processes there, because again, you can have all these measurable pieces, but when you can't measure an internal state, an internal context that then has to be passed on to another operator, and then it makes the whole thing can be fragmented. So while we did such a good job of making it work, right? I mean, we had workarounds for everything, right? With it, and we were very good at it. There's still a lot to be desired in that field, and being able to really make those decisions, because then it leads to this long exposure that then can lead to, hey, guess what? Some days don't go so well, right? Some days, and it's not that like, oh man, I remember years ago, especially, it was, we hear it all, right? All the drone strikes, and oh man, everybody up in arms about them and things like that. And that's the part that everybody gets wrong, right? One, you only ever see the last 30 seconds of a drone strike, which, and I think you and I talked about this previously, with no audio, with no of the communications going on, and no ranging data. Those strikes, you might as well just put lipstick on a pig at that point and be like, hey, look, we did it, right? Because that's the end, right? Nobody sees the hours and hours and days, weeks, months of sitting on that target. And oh, by the way, we watched one guy for 6 years. And when he popped up, it was like, holy crap, we found Waldo. At that point, it was like, so it's that type of piece, right? Because then you've got to and this is where I think the law enforcement tie-in plays actually fairly well, right? Because the way that they operate, and when I talk to the law enforcement professionals, and leaders in that space, I mean, it's just, it's like speaking to a mirror sometimes, where it's like they're under this high cognition load, right? Where all of a sudden I got to ramp up, drop down at any given time. You might be doing super boring crap, right? And then all of a sudden have to flip and go, oh, I got to, throttle all the way up and now perform, right? And so for us, like that, obviously our top bar, right, was me lazing in that weapon for that last 30 seconds, because at that point it's all on me, right? Everybody thinks that like, oh, the pilot does everything. Heck no, they're the bus driver there, and there's pilots that are going to roll their eyes at that. I love you guys. It'll be okay. But they're the dang bus driver, right? With it. And, and then once they pull that trigger, right, they don't get me wrong, they do an insane amount, right up to that point. And they hit that trigger. But then their whole job is to not screw me over at that point, right? Because you have a fixed point onto the bottom of the aircraft that if the camera gets to, if you think about it, if I'm sitting with the camera here, well, eventually as I start going down, once I hit a point here, the camera has to do something, right? I can't just keep going underneath the aircraft, otherwise the picture would be inverted, right, at that point. So I've got to do something. So the camera's got to rotate, spin, do different things. So the pilot's whole job is to, hey, don't screw me, because I've got a live missile in flight that is going wherever I put my crosshairs, right? And they're not, it's the other piece I'll crush real quick is it's like you're not slinging Hellfire missiles and leveling a city block, right? It's like 100 pounds for a Hellfire missile, somewhere around there. I don't remember what the percentage of that is explosives, etc. But it's not that big, right? There's ways to make the boom go bigger, things like that. But for the most part, it's a fairly controlled blast, if you will. So that just meant I got to be a heck of a lot more precise, with it, especially the early days where the missiles had like crappy guidance and, you had weird things with like they would have like titanium sleeves and stuff like that, or, different things on there that would fragment in a certain way. So we had to bring in a bunch of tactics, right, to be able to go, all right, let me make sure I don't miss there, right, with it. So that was a big piece.
The cognitive load as well. I mean, everything that you're mentioning right now, just keeping those minor details in play
exactly.
as you're walking through all of it. That's a ton of good information or very interesting information, if you will. Now, you touched on a few different things that really lead to the precedence of communication, right? So the handoffs that need to be coordinated, but even beyond that internal mission, really how that showcases to the rest of the community. As you're walking through some of these advancements in today's world, just really being able to see that some things may have already been solved a few years back, and just really having that information overload that has caused an ability not to necessarily see all of the information that we've already gone through. So that definitely is a massive portion of what I'd like to discuss today too. Four things that really this all breaks down to into kind of categories here. Really that human side, the technology side, the different responsibility that it takes to actually do the position that you were mentioning, and then kind of that transition from where you are to the next person that comes in and then back to you at certain other regards. I want to spend real time on each one of those today, kind of starting with the human side. Walk me through what an actual shift for you, say, start to finish. What time do you show up? What's that handoff crew before you? And what does the first hour look like, say, versus that hour 10 when you're looking to hand it back off to somebody else?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's one that not a lot of people understand, right? Is, most of the time with these types of operations, they're usually, and I'm sure there's still some units that are, but usually they're trying to cut down on the overall time that people are in the seat, right? And they've induced more like dwell times and things like that with it too. Being able to focus more on like the traditional aviation route, where take a fighter pilot, right? They're home, they're training, right? They're not doing active missions. Where like we had this weird conglomerate of my training was sprinkled in on top of an active mission, right? I might go a screen over and train for an hour and then come back, right? So it's a good, I only bring that up to bring up the foundation of how this works. But usually, right, you're on an 8-hour shift. Some guys ran 12, depending, but most of the time it was like an 8-hour shift, right? But you've got to get there, early to get, the information, the weather, the intel, what the priorities are for the day, right? If we're hunting a bunch of tanks out in the middle of nowhere, well, then I need to know that, right? I need to know what my target is, how to find it, those kind of pieces. So usually just wake up on shift work, right? You're doing shift work. I saw crews or squadrons that were doing 4-week rotations, which were just brutal. And then, we were on 7-week rotations. They've tried a ton of different ones, right? And we were on like a 5-day on, 3-day off which it's like, oh man, extra day off, but usually that first day you just racked out for like almost a whole day straight. I think I slept most of my first day off because it was just a lot, for your brain to go through. But usually wake up, right, put the flight suit on. Everybody loves to rip on that. I could care less. It was the uniform they gave us. We put it on. And we'd go out, drive. It was for me, I was in Vegas, so it was like another 40 minutes up to base there. Then usually had a packed lunch, right, with it because I knew that there's a chance that I most of the time wasn't sitting down at a table to eat a meal, right? I was usually having like a joystick in one hand and a fork in the other. There trying to slam something down. So you've got all these little contingency plans, right, built into your day-to-day. You go into the squadron, you brief, like I said, you get the intel, you get the weather, you get the different pieces there for the mission, right? Figure out who am I flying with, right? Did I win the pilot lottery or not? There, right? Because like anything, you're gonna have people that you enjoy working with. You're gonna have people that you don't as much, like any organization. But figure out, where am I in, right? Because I could be dropped right in right off the go, and I'm sitting 6-7 hours immediately. I could have a 2-hour break and then go to the box, right? And break, and I'm cranking out all the paperwork and all the the crappy jobs that keep the squadron going, right? People's training files, different things like that, whatever it is, managing that stuff across the board. So your day never looked the same, right? With it, you didn't know if you were walking in, and I was walking into a hot seat, right? Meaning there's a strike on the table. They're still waiting for 1 or 2 more boxes to get checked. But the second they do, weapons in flight, right? And so there's many times where I'd walk into a ground control station. I knew from the brief that, hey, we're getting heat. They call it, we're heating up on this, right? Here, and then I knew, all right, if I'm on that starting lineup, which as you get more and more seniority in your squadron, then you're pretty much guaranteed to be in the starting lineup, right? Because you got all the experience there. So you get dropped in there, and I don't know if I'm walking into, following a vehicle that's going 100 miles an hour down some road, sitting on top of a mud hut, watching some guy walk through a market building, or walking in and strikes on the table, and I got to be ready to literally sit down and at any given second just rip that trigger at that point. And, I could just be coming off my weekend. Right, I haven't touched those controls in 3 days, and I mean, I think people can relate to that, right? You get into a vehicle, a piece of machinery, sit down at a computer, operate any type of user interface that you haven't touched in any type of extended period of time, but even 3 days was enough for your brain to be like, how do I do this again? Because I'm trying to maintain, I'm trying to maintain, all these different pieces across the interface there. Right, and so that could be as simple as you jump in the seat and pull that trigger, right? Or it could be, I had plenty of nights where it was walk in, some dude staring at the funniest one I had was there was a building, mud hut, right, where we were operating, and we're just staring at the top of it, and there was a goat just walking around a stick, tied to a stick, and I don't remember how many times I counted that thing walking around that stick. Right, and it was just like you're just like, all right, there he goes again. Oh, he's doing. Oh, now he's wrapped up. Oh, now he's going the other way. Right, because you're just trying to keep your brain semi-engaged at this point. Right, I've got because if it's daytime in the States, guess what? That means it's probably nighttime-ish, right? Depending on time zones, everything else, where I'm operating, which made a unique challenge to it too, because I'm having to. If I walk out of that ground control station, right, sometimes we had ones that were external of the building, right? They're in a super secure, fenced-in location, all this stuff, right? Badges everywhere to get through everything. But I could still walk out and have, like, the sun hit my face, but then I'm operating in a mentality 5 minutes ago where my operational picture is nighttime for it there. So it lended itself to, again, these unique situations that by themselves, individually, is like, what the heck's the big deal? Right? But then you think about all the cognitive processing and all the little brain bites, right, that have to go into maintaining that understanding over time, and across crews and across different things there, and realizing, everything looks normal, right, and everything looks, all right, nothing's going on, but at any given time, I've got to operate at this level like that,
Sure.
with it. And so I think that's a big piece that people don't realize, right? And unfortunately, a lot of the stigmas and the public perception, and the whole it's just a video game, and it's like, give me a break at this point, because it's like that couldn't be farther from the truth, and we're seeing it more and more, right? With Ukraine, with different things there, because those feeds are all over social media, right? And it's really going, all right, like what if you were the one sitting there, right? And the biggest connection I can make, right, is if you can go to a movie theater and bawl your flipping eyes out, to The Notebook or whatever it is, right? Or feel some type of way when the hero, goes down right before, they get the triumphant victory, and you got all that stuff going up and down to you. How in the heck does anyone think that somebody controlling a payload or operating an aircraft halfway around the world and then having to take a life doesn't do something to you cognitively? And that's the part that just gets old to go, how have we not, gotten there with this thinking, right? And we're still in this caveman era of, drones equal video game, drones is easy, kind of there. And it's like, no, there's so much that goes into this, and there's so many crews, right? There's the intelligence crews that are making the calls sometimes, right? Because they've got the authority, right, to say, hey, yep, if we, because they could have that last box check that says, hey, if that's an RPG instead of a rake, pull the trigger, right? And so they're sitting there and they're making that and going, hey, yep, RPG. Well, then what happens when it's a rake? Everybody feels that effects. Everybody feels, oh shit, the wrong call was made, right? And 99% of the time, it's no fault of anybody. It's just, again, that internal representation, right? And then you get the pile-on, right, theory of if one person says, hey, that's an RPG, well, guess what? Everybody around him is going to go, yeah, that could be an RPG, right? And then you've got the mob mentality that plays into it, depending on the operation. So there, like I said, the cognitive gymnastics that play into this role are exceptional, and it's again something that I think we've started down the path a little bit, right, in research and different things there. There's some really good studies the last couple of years that have come out, but I think they're too shallow when it comes to it, because it creates it as an operational stress mechanism, right? Like, burnout, fatigue, stuff like that. That stuff plays a part, but it's more so what happens when these distributed networks are operated in for so long. And you're always planning for worst case. You're always planning for what's happening next, right? And you're always planning for, I have to have an answer for whatever happens on this screen at any given time. And cognitively, that takes a ton out of you, right? And then you try to go into, and I'm sure we'll get into this, right? But the next step, which is what happens when you walk out of that box for the last time. Right, and for me, I did it for 10 years because I did it as a civilian for a couple years after, and it was still the same, same mantra, right? All right, brief, flight, debrief, going through every single step, right? Planning for all these contingencies. But when you do that day in and day out, and there's not even breaks between a day, yeah, you get your weekend or your time off, but it's not like, hey, I'm doing this 2 days of my work week and then I get some, downtime to not be in that mentality. But I can tell you, after 1,000 combat missions and 3,400 hours, I think it changes you a little bit. And I think it's really just that mentality and that process and that cognitive processing carries over and attempts to carry over into a bunch of systems that are really, really bad. Right? I mean, when's the last time you called your bank and had a pleasant experience? Right? It doesn't. It's, it doesn't. When's the last time? I don't know. I'm trying to think of another example, but there's just so many pieces to this that are interesting because, again, you can. There's the day-to-day connections. There's the day-to-day that makes it real, right? But then you go from this super streamlined process to now I got to go into a bunch of systems that don't even understand what an RPA is, right? Don't even understand what an MQ-9 mission entails. But then I'm going to also, on top of it, be like, hey, I think something's wrong. like, or that I'm experiencing really weird ways to try to progress through my day, right? Because I'm always trying to max perform every little thing. It doesn't matter if I'm going to get gas, right? My brain's already calculated out how much fuel's in the tank, what's my distance to empty, how much money is it going to cost to fill up my tank by running a calculation of what's in there, what's not, yada yada yada. I don't need to do any of that crap, but I can tell you, Blake, every single fucking time I go to fill up a gas tank, I'm thinking that way, and it gets really old. To be like, oh, okay, well, it's this much, and it's going to be $34 to do this, and blah, blah. And I'm like, I can't tell you why, I don't need any of that information at the time. But it's trying to plan for those contingencies, right? And trying to grasp onto it, and really, I think, just trying to put this process that was created unintentionally somewhere when you walk away from it.
Yeah, benefit in one regard can be an enemy in another.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, there's a ton of cognitive load that comes into all of that. It seems like one of the most cognitively recognized careers that you could possibly be doing. Now, noticing that really after an 8-hour shift at almost anywhere, cognitive load depletes or goes down to a certain degree, let alone a mission like that. When you're in somewhere for an 8-hour mission and you're constantly having a point where you got to count how many times a goat goes around a stick just to be able to keep yourself entertained, that also puts its own strain on things, let alone when you're going after a mission where you're actually live tracking somebody. So I can
Absolutely.
only imagine what that really does from a cognitive perspective. So how many people are actually in the room with you? I noticed that you ended up speaking about really a pilot, you being the sensor operator and intel coordinator. Who else is really in kind of a room like that, and where does some of that cognitive load start to separate or start to be kind of enhanced with the amount of people that can handle the operation with you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so usually you've got minimum is 2 people in the ground control station, right? You've got this just awkward like galley, if you will, to get from one side to the other. So in early days, right, we would have intelligence coordinators that were sitting directly behind us. They were at another computer that was essentially just a repeater of our screen there, and they would be talking through talking in our headsets, things like that. I'm not even sure that they do that anymore. I think most of it is they're in like a different room in the squadron, right? And then you can have mission commanders. I could be talking to another sensor operator, right? Saying, hey man, what are you seeing over here in this area? Because I'm about to move over there, right? And I need to understand what you've been seeing, right? So exactly like you said, right? That was our way to do those transfers across the board and ensure that I kind of picked up those pieces, if you will, of what was happening on the other side, right? And in this case, it was where my target area is, right? So I would work with that other sensor operator and say, all right, hey, what's the history, or hey, where did they stop, 10 minutes ago? Because we had other screens that had like all the other feeds that were going on in the squadron just on them, right? So you could infer and pull data from them and see that, oh, hey, there's a bunch of clouds going through the feed, right? So they're dealing with weather over there. All right, what altitude are we at, right, compared to them? So that's the kind of unique stuff that, like, that stuff, right? We didn't have standards for that. We didn't have, like, hey, if you're transiting targets, make sure you talk to the other sensor operator and check your altitude and weather. And, like, it was just something we inherently started doing, with it. And we just started having those conversations, and being able to go, hey, what do you see? All right, this is what I know, right? And we kind of go back and forth and really ping off each other and figure out, all right, what's my next role or what's my next step there. So it's those unique pieces that, really drive a lot of those environments. And like I said, you've got just a plethora of communications. I could talk to almost anybody in the squadron. Heck, we had some little old lady call our GCS by accident one time, and she tried to order. I shit you not, she tried to order a pizza, and I was like, "Lady, this is not Domino's. I need goodbye." It was, I haven't thought of that in years, but it was the funniest thing ever because it was like, if that phone rang, it was usually like something kind of one off and wasn't usually like super important, but it was usually some type of like maintenance, comm is like, hey, checking a setting or something like that. And so it's just, hey, this is this ground control station. And she's just like, is this Papa John's? And I'm like, what the hell is happening? I think I looked at the pilot. It was just like, dude, am I getting pranked right now? Like, what's happening there? But it's, so again, then you had like that stuff where it's like, that's not normal, right? I had somebody call me and try to order a fucking pizza and I'm in the middle of a mission. Like, what? It was like,
Where does cognitive ability go there?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, and now I'm like, oh man, I am kind of hungry. Man, the freaking meat lovers do great right now. Like, it's like, because that was always our thing, right? We'd have pizza throughout the squadron. You'd have like usually some major or somebody would be brushing the shoulders. Like we'll buy 20 pizzas for the shift, which was a little morale boost. But it also, we did that. We did the jalapeno corn, right? The fighter pilot community will understand that with that and.
As long as they don't slack on the cheesy bread, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's those different pieces that, again, made it so unique because there's days where it was like you felt like you're almost in an office, right? And there's days where you got the weight of the world on your shoulders and you're trying to make a decision off of a bunch of broken up information, because you might not have been the person that originally saw the target or saw the progression of the target, and you've got to constantly rebuild that maintaining and understanding of what's going on, right? And that's where we see a lot of it in automation now is there's things that they can assist, they can recommend, execute tasks, right? But at the end of the day, you still got to have that authority to approve that, if you will. And that's kind of the pieces that we were kind of exploring, right, through it and going, all right, no, we need to have a check, here. We were constantly refining our tactics, techniques, and procedures across the board to expedite that data flow, right? We had checklists for everything, right, with it, and access to just tons and tons of information, tons and tons of data across the board, but you're always just trying to rebuild that and really make this seamless. It doesn't matter what my brain's doing at the time. If I need to step back into that checklist or that procedure, those steps have to help bolster that, and allow you to draw, if I got to drop that mental task for 30 seconds and then come back to it, I don't need to do this, what I call, don't have to deal with what's called the reconstruction cost of cognition, right? Because it's not just, what's the piece of information? It's why is this relevant, right? When was this taken, right? When did I see that vehicle take a left, right? Because that could all of a sudden become super useful, right? If I knew, wait, I tied that to an event earlier, so maybe that's something I can push up or down the chain, and then it progresses the mission along. There, and I think that's a lot of what AI and autonomy now is really trying to struggle with, and I don't think a lot of them have necessarily been able to put words to that, because why would they, right? Who the heck is going to understand that than a group of individuals that have sat for thousands of hours, and we had guys and got so bored, right? We had a guy build a roulette table on Excel, and it worked. It was insane. Right, we were in Las Vegas. Of course, it was a roulette table, but it was insane, right? Like the whole thing, like you click a button, it ran an algorithm, spun, the ball, or it was a craps table, I think is what it was. There, and so you want to talk about like how we got so streamlined, right? With our processes that we could be building these full other things mid-mission, right? Because we had all these, nice little benchmarks to go off of, and really easy ways to reintegrate cognitively at any step and not really miss that much information, right? With it. Now, did you have people that got lazy with it, and different things like that? Of course, right? Slacked off, weren't doing what they were doing. Yeah, it's any organization, right? But the people that took it, that operated at that high level and really took pride in it was really the ones that were trying to shift that mentality and really shift on how we conducted those operations and how we really preserved that context, being able to detect that drift, right? You could hear it in the tone of somebody's voice, when they drifted off on a checklist step that, maybe Captain Snuffy over there ain't really on board with where we're at right now, right? Maybe I need to say that line again, or go, hey, what's up? What are you working on, right? Because that was always that was one of the biggest things for me as an instructor and an evaluator, right? I moved out of the seat and started going literally backwards. You get farther and farther away from the seat the more you progress. And then it turns a lot into like I'm literally listening for cues in verbal tones, things like that, because I can't see potentially. I had times where I was 4 people back from, you'd have a sensor operator in the seat that was upgrading. You'd have an upgrading instructor, right? Because it's the don't think, do mentality in those upgrades, right? You get it from the reps, the repetition. So you'd have an upgrading instructor that was teaching them. You'd have an upgrading evaluator that was in charge of the instructor and the sensor operator. And then you had me as the overall authority for the whole damn thing. And at any time, I had the authority to step all the way down the chain and literally take the upgrading instructor and evaluator out of the picture if the sensor operator's training was going to be inefficient for their realm, right? So it goes to that whole playing to the lowest common denominator, right? When you walk into a room. And a lot of people look at that and or hear that phrase and are like, oh, you're just playing to the stupidest person in the room. And it's like, no, you're playing to the lowest representation of cognitive understanding. And if you can do that effectively and you can drive home whatever task, whatever procedure, I don't give a shit if it's making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? If I can make those steps make sense, right, and have somebody inserted at any time and know exactly what's already been done, exactly where I'm going with it, and exactly what my objective is, then you're going to be able to improve that process. And that goes a heck of a lot more into the upper echelons of where we're at with AI and everything else, and not just a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right, is being able to do that context reconstruction, because it comes at a cost, right? It's like when you walk into a room and you forget why you walked in there, right? Well, your brain was probably thinking about 3 other things, and then you walked in and it went, I don't know why the hell I'm here, right? Because you're hitting it with all these other pieces. So it's, like I said, really interesting to see now, especially with the advancements in these other areas, to see the similarities and, well, the patterns, right? Because that's when you sit for thousands of hours and watch the same stuff day in and day out, you eventually start just putting these little buckets out there and being like, all right, if he does this, then this is probably going to happen. If they do this, then this is probably going to happen, right? And then it just comes into that mental model being challenged, right? And recognizing that, oh, if my mental model says if he turns right, I'm going to do this, well, then he turns left, guess what? I got to update that mental model, right? I can't continue to work off of that old mentality, because that's going to cause problems and ripple to bigger issues down the line. And that's how you get, people that, like in aviation, where people just slam into the side of a mountain, or, are doing the, pull up, and they're just keep fighting it because they're working off of an old mental model, right? I think was it Air France, I think is the super popular one in that realm, right? Where they just bid off on the wrong thing. Everybody worked off that model, and then eventually they crashed, because of it. So that's really the pieces now that I'm looking into, and a lot of my kind of really what is the driving engine behind Remote Warrior, and really being able to not only capture what we did, because there's just not a lot of education around this stuff, but also drive that question of what happens when somebody is operating for thousands of hours in a cognitively advanced environment and needing to change that mental model, right? And where does that break down, and where does it strengthen? What pieces to what we did strengthened the end goal and the end mission?
Understood. Now, that's really putting in all that heavy SOP culture into things, and it's got to be cool watching that advance over the entirety of your career. I mean, thousands of missions and thousands of hours that have gone into something, where you start to notice all those minor defects that really compound and add to that a full mission. And I appreciate you going over really what separates kind of a great sensor operator from an average one. Somebody that's really able to stay in the mix and stay focused into exactly what they're trying to do. Now, what's something that somebody early on in your career may have taught you that wasn't in any manual that may have added to your ability to actually differentiate what these good portions were versus the ones that needed some help?
Yeah, I got to think on that one for a second, because that's a really good question, and I'm sure there's examples from that, and I think really the direction to go with that is just we had such this building block approach, right, where everything you were doing, it was foundational, right, and then it was build on, build on, build on, right. It didn't matter if it was the instructor upgrade, right. The instructor upgrade for me, I struggled with initially, which is comical because at one point I was running the entire squadron for instructor continuity across the board, and years before I sucked as an instructor. I was, and it was just I was trying to understand the process, really, right, with it, and that was one piece that really stuck with me is to effectively train someone, especially when you're doing it in these condensed environments, right, where I got to rapidly train this person and get them out to the field, right? I think of how we did software upgrades, right? And I promise this will connect. The software upgrades, we would get them for our aircraft, and it could change, how the fuel was routed. It could change. We had one that changed almost every button on the console and how it operated. And guess what? I got a 15-minute brief before the mission on a bunch of academic slides on how it worked. Me and all the other instructors would have to go in. We call it figure out how to break it, right? Essentially, where are those thresholds? Where are those points that this stuff breaks, right? And where mission-wise is this not going to work? So we'd sit there and it'd be like two instructors per ground control station would be kind of going off each other and going, we'll try this, because then you'd get that backseat, understanding, right, and being able to recognize when somebody is not right there at the controls, right, 2 inches from the screen, because those two, again, exactly what we're talking about, those two pieces provide very different mental models of what's going on, right, from being an operator to sitting back, right? And so that's something that in the furnace of it, right, when I was doing it, it was years later before I recognized, like, wow, that was a really effective way that we approached those software upgrades. Because then it was figure out how to break it. We'd swap. I'd get in, sit down, mess with it, and we'd talk through, all right, these are the limitations, different things like that. This is how it's supposed to work. This is how it actually works, right? Which I think is like every engineering problem ever, right? You can create the best thing in the world, but if the operator does something just out of left field with it and you don't plan for it, there you go,
All about the parameters.
Yep. And so, we'd figure out what are the extremes of that, because we had such dynamic targeting, right, and dynamic processes and missions on any given night. Well, it also bled into how we developed our instructors, because a lot of it was all right, you're going to go in and watch an event be taught by an experienced instructor, right? So they sit back and they just osmosis take this in, right? They get to see the interaction between the student and the instructor. They get to hear what questions are asked. They get to hear what recommendations the instructor makes. And like for me, I would do a lot of the upgrade events for the instructors in the squadron. And so I'd have to go in and explain on the back end, like, this is why I'm thinking this way, right? This is the things that I'm trying to drive home. And sometimes, the obvious answer isn't the one that you need, right? You got to dig a little bit farther and figure out, all right, if this person's struggling with an event, why at that point? So we would have them observe, right? Then we'd have them actually just do a practice brief. Essentially brief the topic, right? Could be close air support, right? And I'm about to piss off a whole bunch of pilots in this, and I could not care less. But we were trained in tons of different mission sets that nobody realizes, right? We were trained in close air support, right? I knew the 3093 like the back of my hand, which is the joint pub for CAS. We were trained in strike coordination reconnaissance. We were trained in combat search and rescue. That's the crazy part, right? We were trained that if it needed to be happened, right? And were we experts by any of this stuff? Hell no, right? We were experts at our system, but we had the exposure to those mission sets and had the mentality, right, that if we got called upon and we needed to do those, right? And I saw plenty of CAS events in my time that we were ready to go, right? And so they'd go in and they would do a brief around one of these areas, right, for it. And then also on top of it, then they would come in and actually do the event with the instructor or whoever's their instructor kind of sitting. Then they're kind of sitting in the corner just watching and seeing how the interaction happens between them and the student, that kind of stuff, right? So it was really about this information flow, and it's something that until my recent research, especially in the last year in this area, I didn't fully connect the dots, right? We'd say a lot of the things, right, on with how we did our briefs and that kind of stuff, right? Our briefs were always, I was told, when I was teaching somebody how to brief, hey, it's the what, when, how to do something, right? Leave the why for the debrief, because at that time, when you got a 2-hour time block, that 2-hour vol that you got to fly in, I got to make sure that I get all my, learning objectives, those boxes checked off as I'm going through. And so me in that role, I'm kind of shifting those around because all of a sudden weather might roll in, right? And it pushes us down in altitude. And maybe I can't do that tactic or that weapons procedure anymore, or I have to front load a certain weapons procedure because we know weather's rolling in 30 minutes, right? Or a bunch of F-16s are checking into the airspace and we got to move, blocks there for it. That's the kind of stuff that we had to manage that nobody taught us how to manage, right? It was just kind of it was really this conglomerate, right? And that's why it's so important, especially tying this into now with like drone for first responder programs, where these UAS programs are driving towards, right? You have to have a heck of a lot more than those standard operating procedures to truly be effective, right? And it's a lot of the techniques, it's a lot of these codified TTPs that give you the ability to lean back on them. But the greatest strength that comes from this is knowing when to pivot off of them and why. And being able to go, I'm going to take some foundation from this process, but I'm going to apply it in this different way, or I'm going to use, or I'm going to completely ignore it maybe. But I had to make damn sure that if I was, ignoring a codified process or trying to manipulate it, that I had a defensible reason. Right? Otherwise, I was getting roasted in that debrief by my whole squad, my whole team just being like, "Why did you, Because that was how we did everything, right? Is at the end you debrief it all, and we would have, the screens up, and now they've gotten so more advanced than back in my day. We had one screen we'd debrief off of. Right now they can pull in a whole bunch of other screens too, but it just gives you more information on being able to reconstruct exactly where that aircraft is in a point in space, and then bring in the operator back and go, what were you thinking here, right? Why'd you turn left instead of right? Or why'd you turn that laser on at this time instead of this other time, right? Or why'd you change cameras for this type of target, right? And just kind of pulling in, and then expanding that information. And being able to disseminate it out, right? And this is where I think a lot of, law enforcement programs that are getting drones and stuff like that, they don't have that type of infrastructure set in place to necessarily, because again, it's looked at as a tool. It's looked at as an additional duty, right? When it comes down to it, it's looked at as like, hey, go pick that thing up and just start flying it, and all right, when we're done, cool. Instead of going, all right, hey, maybe there's a certain way that we can employ this repeatedly every single time that can give us the outcome that we're looking for. But that's the challenges now that like UAS is really hitting on, and I think hitting some friction points, because now there's no real standardization authority for that side of it.
Sure. No. The who, what, when logic that you're building out within everything, besides the briefs having that why component that's added in there. Is there any other contingency that you guys had in place from as you were operating here to make sure that nothing really fell through the cracks or went by the wayside as people were going through these operations?
Yeah, so just like you said, right? Your brief would cover your what, when, how. Your debrief was the one that was the why, right? Because that's where you just strip apart what their logic, what they're thinking, stuff like that. But absolutely, right? Because and that's the thing. We covered the boring stuff, right? We covered, hey, who's all in the room right now, right? Hey, what aircraft is this, right? What ground control station are we going out to, right? It's those little things that like people go, we don't need to worry about that, right? But that's the stuff that just eats away at the cognitive load, and especially when you're going in to do a mission and in any type of dynamic environment. If you can have, a lineup card or something that has all that information out there, has what your mission is for the day, I'd always create what we call tactical objectives, right? Essentially, how to achieve that mission objective, right? You put 3, 4, 5 of them on the board. You make them. You do that typical SMART, right? Goal orientated system, right? Measurable, attainable. I don't remember what the S is. Specific, I think. But making those, again, actually gradable, right, for it, and then going in and going, all right, let's talk about, hey, how are we feeling for the mission, right? Is everybody good, right? Did somebody's dog just die last night, right? And they're maybe not into it right now, and and so we talk about those things, right? We talk about, the intel, the weather, the those pieces there, and then we get into really those codified tactics, techniques, and procedures. And the early phases, right, was a lot of, all right, I'm going to show you how to do this maneuver, how to, especially a brand new topic, right? They would walk through it in detail. Myself and the pilot, we'd both have our kind of sections in the brief. We'd sit there and we'll call trade the pens back and forth. All right, whoever's got the pens is the talker, right? So the talking stick. Nobody else talks without them. So they'd go through their section. And then, all right, do you have anything? Yep, let's talk about these contingencies here, right? So we kind of tell it like a story, right? And that was one of the most effective ways, when I got with really good pilots that understood how I operated, I understood how they operated, and we kind of found a good common, way to brief together. Then it really drove home those points. And then you really just expand it from not only, all right, now they get a C, right? Because as us as the instructor cadre, we're writing all this stuff on the board, super specific, right? How to do this stuff. Well, one thing is they don't just do it once and then, all right, you're done. Right? We'd give them different scenarios, crank up the heat with every single one, right? And have, 3, 4, 5 iterations of that mission in a phase, what we'd call. Well, by the 5th one, guess what? The pilot, the student crew, the pilot and the sensor operator are pretty much briefing it themselves at that point, right? Because at this point, we're like, dude, you've seen this 4 times, right? You should be able to talk about it, right? So it's like the most common thing in instruction ever, right? To be a good instructor, you have to be able to communicate the process that you're doing and teach it, right? Well, same thing for the student learning process is then I've got to worry about, all right, if I can get them to teach it back to me and then go execute it, right? Not just leave it at that and go, hey, yeah, you did a great job. You can talk real well. But now it's, soup to nuts. Can you get in there and actually do the tactic, technique, or procedure that you're briefing, right? And so, and the same thing on the other side, right? They would go through, obviously, in the ground control station then, we're not talking as much in those later phases, right? I'm letting them flail. I'm letting them make mistakes. I'm letting them screw up, and I'm letting them sit in it. Because if I went in and every single time hammered them and said, hey, why'd you do this? Why didn't you do this? Right? They're not learning anything. All they're learning is to react to every time I open my mouth, they're doing something wrong and they need to change it. They don't know why. They don't understand it, right? So in the later phases, we just let them flail. And especially when I became an evaluator and it was essentially, all right, now this is a box check. You're good to go fly this mission, graduate, initial qualification training, go on to advanced mission sets, right? That was our authority as an evaluator. Is I'm signing them off saying, yes, you can do this next piece, right? And that one was even more of a, for the first like 70% of that mission from the brief into the mission itself, I barely said a thing, right? I'd come in, set the standard for, this is the, Air Force manual that we're following for our regulations. This is what the guidance is. This is your grading criteria. This is how all this is going to flow. And then it was pretty much, all right, man, markers in your hand. Let's see what you got, right? And all the way through debrief. And there's times where I wouldn't say a word. And I'm just sitting there writing notes. And then I would wait for them right? How we treated our debriefs was I would wait for them to debrief themselves. So they would have to go through and go, all right, looking at the video, looking at where we were, looking at all these pieces, this is what we missed, right? Or this is why we screwed it up. They could be completely wrong, right? They don't know any better. They're students. They've only seen it a handful of times. How would they? But that's where it's bringing in the experience and going, all right, yes, that's a good consideration, but maybe you should think about this too. Or eventually at some point it would literally just be, all right, good job. Let me take the pens back, right? And now I'm going to talk you through and essentially hot wash this to go through. Here's some things that, you said initially, right? Because that was always the thing. We were always closing that loop on the learning process. It was, you said this in brief, right? You did this in the seat, and you just told me your reasoning in the debrief was XYZ. But what if it was actually ABC? And so it's being able to drive that learning process and pull that from them and go, yes, you're on the right route, right? But because of these things that I see, because of my experience, right? So what does that get down to when you strip it all apart? It's letting them screw up, right? It's letting the kid fall over on the bike 15 times and go, well, why is that happening? And letting them kind of make that decision first and drive that critical thinking. Could be completely flipping wrong, right? They could be way off in left field, and it's like, dude, that's not at all how that works, right? It was one piece that as I went through training, that was always the hardest part was defending why you did something, right? And defending why I said a certain thing, and then it's like, oh gosh, like it's all there, right? Hearing yourself on the radio and all that, and hearing yourself talk was always the everybody hated that, right? It's like, there's my voice again in the back. With it. But again, you're just trying to really drive this learning process through, but it was such a unique exposure by sitting in quite literally those different seats, right? From doing it to instructing it to then evaluating it. And I've got to kind of just shift up and downstream the way that my thought process is working, for these certain environments, because I don't care if the basic sensor operator is screwing up a bunch of things, as long as the instructor's catching it, cool. I'm not going to just come over the top rope and be like, oh yeah, by the way, Sergeant X said this and you didn't do that right at all. Like, I'm just going to go, yep, that was a good point, and move on, right? Because I've got to then trust that instructor, even if they're going through upgrade, it doesn't do them any good if I just come in and keep top roping the heck out of them with every single point and going, well, actually, one more pile on, right? Let me pile on to what the commander said. Every commander's call ever. But
so it's to add to that cognitive breakdown.
Absolutely.
Yeah, honestly, I think the same thing in a similar mission. When I was going through flight school, I always kept repeating the same phrase to myself. It was, complacency is the devil, so chase your failures, right?
Yeah.
So get through as many of those failures as you possibly can to be able to get to that successful point on the end.
Absolutely.
Another one I always used to like to rephrase all the time was the fact that you don't know a piece of information until you can teach it to a kindergartner.
Yes.
And it was really being able to break it down to the most simplistic level before actually being able to move on to whatever that next thing was. So, like,
100%.
what went well, what didn't go so well, and what are we going to do better tomorrow?
Yep. Absolutely.
You touched on a ton of very useful information up to this point, and we've been at it for about an hour at this point too. I'm curious, before we move on to that technology piece of things, is there something that you think about at all that you haven't necessarily talked about much publicly, and in terms of really, is there a specific moment, doesn't necessarily have to be the hardest one, but just a real one that you'd want to leave the public with after this conversation?
I think that one of the biggest pieces to this, right, is people, again, the misconception of what it is, right? And so the operators themselves, they constantly have to be, re-explaining their experience for years and years and years on end with it. And it doesn't matter if it's a doctor, if it's whoever it is, right? It could be, because the FAA, there's so many regulatory pieces that this can dip into, right? Especially if people go civilian into the civilian work for this, that is just not very well understood, right? And so that's really a lot what we're transitioning kind of remote warrior into, is trying to capture those experiences and kind of just time capsule them, right, across it, but do a heck of a lot more than that and try to advance, the take those lessons learned that we did, and put them out there. Because again, it's such a funny thing that after 15 years, you don't necessarily, nobody's running around talking about Reaper, right? You get the cool, hey, last 30 seconds of that video. That's it, right? That's all anybody sees. Nobody talks about the human aspect of it. Nobody talks about those things, and it's something that even for me in my own journey, my own mental health journey, is trying to understand. What is this driving? And so, it's a hard piece because a lot of people cast a lot of judgment, and a lot of, oh well, it's just X Y Z, and it's like no, there's a lot more to it than that. One, the operations alone, but then what is it doing downstream, cognitively, to these operators and different things there? Because and not just that, oh man, we need another group to worry about within the Department of Veterans Affairs or whatnot, right? It's what can we learn from these processes that we've been doing, right? Because we keep trying to solve some of these issues without looking back and realizing, hey, we've stood in this field before. We just didn't take the right amount of notes, right? And that's where, while there's been studies and things like that have done, it's really trying to drive this force to be able to think, hey, maybe I can do something then, just operate a payload on a camera or a camera on an aircraft, something like that, if I get out of it, especially for the sensor operator side. But even the pilot, right? It's that way of thinking and understanding that cognitively, there's a lot of benefits that came out of how we operated. We had one of the most streamlined processes to training and cognition and retaining information that arguably should be studied so much more than what it is. But the biggest piece is that I can promise anybody that sees this video, and especially the ones that have done the job, have hacked the mission, there's plenty that feel the exact same way. Because I get calls at least every other month of somebody else, of an operator that is just cognitively burnt to a crisp, right? And they don't know what to do. And unfortunately, that leads into like veteran suicide and different things like that and those hard discussions. Because they feel like they get to a point that I can't explain what I've been through. And if no one can even understand what an RPA is, let alone what happens on the other side of it, that leaves a lot of gaps, right? And a lot of care systems that are decades behind, unfortunately, because of it. And it's not to the fault of anybody, but I now see, doing the advocacy piece of this for the last year, why every generation of veteran has such a damn hard time breaking through that glass ceiling and going, hey, this is an issue. And like I said, I don't think it's, hey, it's, oh, drone operators are getting PTSD and all this stuff. Like, no, I'm not going to make that claim. But I do think it's creating a very unique cognitive challenge that our current systems can't necessarily measure, can't necessarily define. And so that leads a lot for, especially, the high ops tempo and what we had to deal with, right? Because it wasn't what we saw with our missiles, right, that screws people up when it comes down to it. For me and my post-traumatic stress, it was watching the people do just inhumane things to each other across the board. And essentially, if you can think of a way that one human can kill another one, I've seen it through a camera after thousands and thousands of hours. And that's the part that makes it hard to open up those conversations about things like moral injury, PTSD, different things there, and then goes on to ripple and affect, families, job retention, all these different pieces, reintegration into the community. And I write a lot about that kind of stuff, right? And I do a lot of articles, especially on my LinkedIn page, on just trying to make sense of that and put words to it. And work with a lot of human factors researchers. My network is just getting more and more vast with trying to really pull in these key people to not just understand it for the veterans that have already done it, but to understand where we're going technologically and what the downstream effects of these all are.
Absolutely. No, I think from a PTSD standpoint, the big thing that has occurred has been really in broad buckets of things, not necessarily in those specific, really detail-oriented positions, and how each one is separately affected.
And that I'll say one other thing on that real quick is that right there is one of the biggest cruxes that I hit, right? When I started going down the kind of, holy crap, I'm getting affected in really funny ways from this, and I probably have some type of, post-traumatic stress. The very first question on any intake form of that is, tell me about the event, right? Or with the event. And for people like me that come from this field and go, dude, which one do you want?
Right.
Because I had the event every flipping day for years on end. It's like I can't just sit there and cherry pick, and I'm very open about my mental health journey, right? I've tried tons and tons of things under the sun to help with this, and it's so hard because even the intakes that are built around this are like, well, tell me about the one event that happened, and I'm like, I can't, and then you hit friction points because the provider's like, well, I mean, just tell me about the worst one, and it's like, it doesn't work that way, right? After a point, that just it all is just noise. And you just know that you feel a certain way, and you don't exactly know why.
Well, it adds to the shutdown,
Yep.
right? So once you end up having this acknowledgement that it's not necessarily what is being provided in that intake, it almost seems like you're too helpless to help, And that's the hardest part of any mental health journey, is really just noticing that there's differentiations from the points that people have already gone through and what they're generally used to handling versus what a certain bucket of people might. Now that's something that I definitely believe should be added deeper into the VA.
Absolutely.
And exactly, just in the terms of what we study from a psychological perspective.
Yeah.
Because there are so many nuanced variants to exactly how that problem can get handled, and it's different for every single person. So it's
Absolutely.
it's definitely a tough topic to end up really wrapping all of the variables around into one thing. Now to take a brief kind of change on some of the things we're talking about here. Not to lighten exactly the value or the need for exactly what you're talking about, but to go deeper into kind of that technology side of things. 10 years from now, in your opinion, does the sensor operator role as you knew it still exist, or has the autonomy kind of absorbed most of that due to some of the issues that we're talking about today?
I think it's more going to shift. Actually, the sensor operator is going to be a little more useful, because, and it's not in the traditional sense, right? It's going to be some conglomerate, right, of understanding the pilot side of it, right, but also understanding the mechanism behind the technology. And what I mean by that is essentially, we can sit here and talk about one-to-many and how they want, certain XYZ type of things. Have one operator that controls a whole fleet of drones, and you get into that with swarm technology and stuff like that. And that's great, but what nobody's measuring is the cognitive load that happens with that, right? And it's great when it's running perfectly, right? But I think of, things like that drone light show event that happened a couple years ago that like injured a small child, and there's a bunch of things, there was a handful of things that went wrong with it, right? But that's the stuff that people aren't necessarily looking at when they're building these systems is, okay, what happens when 3 drones go off and fly some completely different flight plan than I needed to, and you've got one operator trying to control all 3 at the same time and give them individual commands, right? So my point being is, I think we're going to get away from the stick and rudder skills, right? And I think it's going to be more of this supervisory control piece, right? And that it's going to be a person sitting in the type of operations cell that is, all right, launch this one, send it here, that kind of thing. But I can't fully say what that looks like because I don't know what the answer yet is for the cognition piece to this, because we can have all these data points that we want, but when we're not recognizing how to transfer one internal state from one person to another, that's going to cause a lot of problems, as these, especially with Part 108, and they're already trying to kind of make some interim. Well, that's not going to cover enough, and beyond visual line of sight, and that's great. But all I'm doing is then extending the workload to the operator at that point, and so then I'm just shifting the effects up or downstream, depending on what I'm doing, right? And that's the biggest misconception with AI and things like that, right? It's created just these insane ways to just compress these processes, which is fantastic, right? I use AI daily. in research and things like that, because it can bolster so many different areas. But it's not the solution, right? The human is still the solution. The human still needs to be taken into account for this, and being able to, understand, automation can assist, recommend, execute tasks, right? But the human has to still maintain responsibility for not only the execution but the understanding of that technology. And I think that's a piece that, again, we can learn from, but I think it's going to be turned into a really real big bottleneck here, with where we can go with it. And it's something that I don't think necessarily we're figuring out, right? I look at like Anduril, right? They've got a really cool software they built for NASCAR that essentially puts in a flight plan, right, for you and I in aviation speak, right, a flight plan of because NASCAR is insanely technical, right? All those things, I mean, RPM, everything is just down to the minute detail. Well, when you can train a model to replicate that and say, all right, this is what you should be doing, and then essentially debrief it, that's great, right? But that, again, is still functional data points that I can physically see and measure, right? I can measure a trajectory on a racetrack. I can measure heat temperatures. I can measure sensor outputs. I can measure all these things. But that doesn't mean that if I put one person I'll keep with the NASCAR analogy, right? If I put one person in that seat and I put somebody else that has the exact same knowledge, the exact same understanding, knows all the rules, knows everything, right? And people can speak fluidly, they're still going to operate in two different methods at some point with some type of process that happens, right? And that's going to ripple, right, and change. And I honestly think that's where a big piece of AI is interesting, because if you and I sat down doesn't matter, pick your platform, pick your agent here, right? If you and I sat down and started on the exact same sentence on AI, within 2 minutes, we'd be in completely different realms if we continued it on like a conversation there. And because of that, it's driving those internal representations, right? But we haven't necessarily figured out how to capture that genie in a bottle yet, right? Which is why all the arguments are like, oh my gosh, AI is hallucinating. It's like, no, you just haven't put enough bounds on it to make it do exactly what you need. So arguably the people that say that, I'm like, actually it's a you problem, because you didn't put enough constraints on your AI program and give it enough guardrails to operate in all the ways that you're trying to break it. If you keep hitting it hallucinating and having issues, you haven't done enough within your LLM to give it the correct rule set to manage your workload, when it comes down to it, because it's possible, right? People are doing it all the time. It's why that you see the military using it, right? You see all these different programs that are, using AI to better these processes. So, like I said, it's an interesting kind of circle, if you will. It keeps going round and round with these topics, and I think it's really important for the progression of where we go with this, and to do good things with it, because it doesn't matter if it's a fleet of autonomous aircraft or one aircraft or making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? You still got to be able to identify the internal state and measure that to truly make these systems create, these proper handoffs between environments, between, these different things before that performance degrades.
Absolutely. It's to that same point, it seems like a major reframe of our minds, really being
Absolutely.
able to set those parameters and those guidelines around our communication, and not talking to the AI the same way that we would have a general conversation.
Absolutely.
The moment you bring in one word that's a differentiation from somebody else, you get a completely different answer from it as well. Now, you've sat in one of the most operationally rigorous career paths that you could possibly have. Before we actually started this, you ended up saying how MQ9 is really one of the first large-scale examples of supervisory control. That's really the part that I kind of want to sit with for a minute here. What does history actually predict from your experience over the course of really how you've seen those advancements take place while you were internal with the MQ9, and really what happens afterwards in terms of civilian flying or other industries? What are the top 3 takeaways from an executive or supervisory control board that you think would be useful in any industry around?
Yeah, like I said, I think a lot of it just hinges on this internal representation, right? And one, you've got to have ownership of that operational model, right? It doesn't matter if it's if it's a surgeon in an operating room, if it's an AI company, if it's an aerospace company, like you have to have an ownership of that operational model because, and that's something that we did, right? It wasn't always when we were flying Reaper, right? It didn't matter what rank people were, right? That's one misconception that we didn't really talk about is like when me and a lieutenant colonel were flying together and I'm A1C Yackley, right? Been in all of 2 years in the military, and him and I are talking like we're just bros, right? Because at the end of the day, we're sitting in there, and we understand. Hey, you bring this skill set to the fight. I bring this skill set to the fight. Neither of us can do our job without the other person, and we got to respect that, right? And so I think that goes into, and really it did, and not by necessarily a named process, but it was really just this ownership of that operational model, right? And it was that, hey, you could have, Airman Snuffy could be the dude that's like, hey, I need to call an abort right now because of we'll use our fun training one. The bus full of nuns just pulled up, right? And I gotta abort that, right? Well, that might be on me to make that call because the pilot might be looking at something else. They could be looking at a different screen, right? And it's not that I'm necessarily making the call, right? I don't want people to confuse that, right? We didn't just throw authority around left and right. You still had your structure where true the actual executable authority, but you had cognitive authority within these systems. You knew, right? I knew the pilot. Yeah, I was backing him up on ranging and hey, don't bust that airspace border and things like that. But at the end of the day, bro, that's your job, right? It's not my job to fly the plane, right? I can make all the calls in the world. If the dude just ignores me, I've run to the end of my rope, right? I can't, without, besides like reaching over and grabbing the joystick and turning the plane, I'm out, right? Same thing with me, right? They could sit there and talk at me all day long on, hey, I think you should do X, Y, Z. And if I'm just like, dude, get out of here, right? Right or wrong, right? I still hold the cognitive authority in that piece, right? So I think that's an interesting part that really drives where a lot of this discussion is going and a lot of autonomy and different things, right? Is recognizing that as we try to distribute these networks, as we try to push this stuff out there, you're going to have times that different levels of operations or different levels of personnel, controllers, operators, I don't give a shit what you call them, right, are going to have different levels of understanding. And without giving those individuals in those moments the authority, that's where you see, like, again, law enforcement, right? You have tons of representatives. And it's not just, hey, the cops are here, we're good, right? You've got cops, you potentially have firefighters, you got state representatives, you got all these different things, all these different pieces, right, that are flowing in there. And it's a friction point that they're hitting right now. Because a lot of it, and I think about like even the counter UAS stuff, right? Counter UAS, you got detect, identify, track, defeat, right? It's a beautiful kill chain. But a lot of that is the authority issue of, all right, hey, I got the technology, but who owns the final decision to act, right? And that's where, regulatory pieces are coming into play. And that one we could have a whole nother episode on that because that gets into like FCC regulations, a lot of different authorities that people don't realize are baked into those processes, right? Because everything you're doing with counter US for the most part, besides shooting a net at them, is for the most part running on some type of frequency. So the FCC wants their pound of flesh when it comes down to that. And then, again, automation can assist, recommend, and execute tasks, right? But it's not going to ever replace that human. And, that's why you see almost even the AI programs that, they're real careful. And if you read how they put out their bulletins whenever they're like fully autonomous, and it's like, and there's always this little asterisk somewhere in that sentence or somewhere in that headline that's like, well, up until the last second, and then somebody hit a button, and it's like, yeah, exactly, and so I think we need to try to quit, trying to rip the human out of the loop. Obviously, you're gonna have you got human in the loop, human on the loop, right? There's some balance here, right? And I also think that in itself, right, needs to be restructured in the way that we think about it, because every phase of flight, every operation, it doesn't matter what it is, right? You're going to have different authoritative controls that are needed depending on where the human is in or on the loop. Because if that isn't granted and set in stone, then you're going to have massive amounts of confusion when somebody goes, that brand new person sits down day 2 on the job, and that alert pops up and they go, what do I do? Right? And it's not that what do I do? It's a lot of times, right? Because that cheapens what these people have been through, right? A lot of times people know what they should be doing. They just don't know if they have the authority to act and be able to change that. And so that's why you get freeze. That's why you get, people that are like, I think of my own kids when I'm talking to them. I've got a teenager now in the house that I'm like, dude, what the heck was that? And he's like, I don't know. And it's like, what do you mean you don't know? It's like, how we just talked about this, whatever, right? But they thought in the moment that, hey, maybe I don't got to worry about that authority, right, in that realm, and I can get away with doing X, Y, Z, right, there. So I think those are really the big kind of takeaways. I don't know if I necessarily broke those down cleanly into 3 different ones, but I think that's the biggest takeaways with this is there's a lot of lessons learned within this. There's a lot of ways that we can do this better, and I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and to truly progress this industry and truly ripple this throughout anybody that's dealing with any type of cognitive demand, right? Because that's the crazy part, and that's a lot of what I just put out an article this morning actually on this, saying things like, guess what, nuclear, aerospace, defense, NASA. I think we're all trying to solve a similar piece of the problem. We just don't have the same language across the board. Because if you look at any high cognitive demand job and you start peeling apart the frameworks of them, man, the dots that connect there are wild when it comes to that. And I think that's a big direction for supervisory control and all these discussions when it comes to especially autonomy and those different pieces.
Understood. And I appreciate it there also. It definitely puts the need for the regulatory manner around the parameters that we're putting in place from an autonomy perspective. Just being able to have that leadership actually going through, but people really starting to take that ownership and their certain strength of the argument here. Because it's affecting every industry. I mean, as we deal with AI, as we deal with autonomy in general, or these autonomous tools, this is really something that's affected everything from the trades through the military and the government. So something that is going to have to be a top of mind for absolutely every single person walking into the new age, and how we're modernizing even the way that we're thinking about a lot of this. We don't want to walk into an iRobot type situation.
Yes. Yep, exactly. We don't want to be Will Smith here and trying to take them all down. I think it's a balance, right? And I think it's like anything new. I mean, gosh, you look at history, and anytime any new technology, right, was put into place, almost everything that we have. And this is where I love the History Channel way too much. I'm starting to become that guy. I'm like, oh crap, I hit 34, and now I'm like, History Channel. I'm like, shit. Now I'm gonna end up getting some like weird fascination into World War II history or something like that with it. But it's funny when you sit back and look at some of these things and look at these advancements, and most of them were just completely shut down, right? And completely like that's never going to work. There's no way, with it. And so
I think some of that's really the fear of change.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
A lot of people that really are just fearful of that change management, how exactly they're supposed to manage themselves and the outer world around them once these advancements are actually put in place.
So what you'd be saying is they have a fear of their own internal reasoning and the way they perceive what is happening, which could ultimately be one of the cruxes of all of this, right? Is
Absolutely.
how do you measure, not only measure that, but then capture that on the back end to make that not so fearful.
Yeah, it's something to really handle the insecurity around it, because we live in a world now where almost nothing is secure. We can't even necessarily look at a video and be able to tell if it's an actual video or if it's something that was just made on a computer here. So just having that insecurity that starts to pop up in the back of people's minds, that really takes that extra couple seconds to be able to make a decision or to actually evaluate the way that the people are thinking about things versus the action that's needed around those things. So And to the point of being able to have a few different episodes off of the things that we're talking about here today, I think
Yeah,
there's plenty of depth to be able to go into. Um,
absolutely.
but just to tie this back into some of that C-suite level of things, if you were to be put in charge of the entire career field tomorrow around that aviation sector, full authority and say no budget constraints whatsoever, aside from some of the things we've spoken about already, what's the first structural thing that you would change?
I think the number one thing I would change is to recognize cognitive supervisory work as its own operational competency.
Okay.
And so being able to recognize, again, we have all these fragmented processes of high cognition load for the operators and different things. Why are we not looking at more of the mechanisms behind them and really driving home that point? And again, I think that's a little bit of a brash way to say that, right? Because it infers that none of these research groups or anything are doing anything. But I think it's just really that zooming out and recognizing, those pieces. So measure what matters, right? Understanding, prediction, prioritization, recovery, right? Because we know, it's like an athlete, right? You know that I can't run at 100 miles an hour 24/7, right? I'm going to get burnt out and everything else. So same thing with the cognition piece, right? And really looking at, how that's measured across the board. And then I think a big piece to this, and it ripples to a lot more than just the MQ9 community, but it's a perfect example, is treating the handoffs, right? Handing off one, my internal state to another as operational events and not just some administrative event. Because that's, I think, one of the key pieces to this is recognizing the data transfer that's happening there in those handoffs and how much gets lost in translation across the board. And I think, and I know that none of those three things necessarily, tie back into veterans and things like that with it. But I think that is a piece that then once, there's a National Defense Authorization Act study to look at the cognitive effects of remote warfare. Now, unfortunately, I think they have the potential to miss the mark by structuring it off of these older mechanisms that they have been for the last better part of 25 years. They started studying it in 2003, but it's really being able to build then the processes and the recovery around that, and recognizing, hey, you're going to have chronic responsibility, you're going to have long exposure, you might deal with moral injury, right? And a lot of things that people deal with might be different. And I'm keeping this fairly wave top because, like I said, I think the very first group that's going to get hit with this is law enforcement. They're already in the operational tempo. They already have the same mindset. They train almost very similar frameworks to being able to do that up-down mentality. And unfortunately, just like we did back in the day, they're looking at UAS as, oh, that's a nice toy. We'll just have, Lieutenant Snuffy run it for today. And instead of realizing, there needs to be a lot more put in place. Otherwise, instead of a cool tool that can expedite, the process, then it can cause a drain on the entire system.
No, I think you're right on par with that public safety sector. Really, the majority of public safety tends to follow that military aspect in certain advancements that have been made. So from a cognitive perspective and an operationally handoff mark that you were just going into, I think that those are really key points in how the operation is going to change as well. But let's get detailed here. What would you say is really something that people can do from an individual standpoint if they're trying to walk into careers like this after going through everything you've already gone through, from say that mental health side, from the operational readiness side? What can individuals do to be able to make that better for themselves? Because we obviously have like the I'm safe model or the SMART model, and a few different ones that come into play as far as being able to notice what stresses or external features are really going to affect us cognitively. But let's go deeper than that for one section. What do you think is really the core importance for somebody to be able to put in place or to have mandatory for themselves if they're walking into an operation like that?
I mean, I think the biggest piece of that is recognizing, one, that it's not nearly as cheap of an operation, right? And I mean that in a cognitive load retrospect, right? You're burning. A great human factors person I work with uses this analogy of tokens, right? Anytime you're doing any type of cognitive work, doesn't matter what it is. So it's recognizing when those tokens are being burned, right? Recognizing when, oh crap, I just did a bunch of different things, and I might need to recover from that. And so one, it's not only the internal representation, but it's the communication of it, right? It's talking about this differently, right? Within the units, within bro to bro, all of it, right? The networks, it's going, hey, what is truly happening, here? What was your internal representation of this, and what changed, right? And because I think that's a big piece that once we start treating, and incorporating this into debriefs, incorporating this into the way we train, these processes, and we really talk about them, because I think that's a big piece to this that is not discussed enough, clearly. But I think it also has the most area for advancement within when understanding comes to light, for that, and that's the only reason I'm not getting as detailed as right now is because I don't have an answer for that fully yet. It's one area that I'm constantly pulling at the strings and going, all right, how did we get here? I look at like NASA human factors guidelines and the things that have happened, since the Challenger explosion, and what changed, fundamentally down the line, and because obviously that bleeds over into aviation. It's a lot of governing there. So again, it's having this deeper level of conversation, and understanding like, hey, why did you just do that? Hey, what were you thinking when this? And it's not accusatory, right? It's not like, all right, what the hell? It's just, learn from the mindsets within this, because the only way we're going to be able to get to a place that we can measure this stuff to then better the technology down the road is talking about it.
Gain more data through communication.
Exactly.
Now, from aside from just the communicatory value, have you found anything personally that's allowed you to really refurbish those tokens slightly faster than previously put in place?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I do is, I work a lot with like trying to externalize, factors, and that's where a lot of like my AI work comes into play. Is I work a lot with like essentially, what processes do I do in any given day, right? For me, I deal with a lot of cognitive overload. It doesn't matter what time of day it is; it can just hit out of nowhere, and it's like, holy cow, right? I feel like my skull's on fire, or like my thoughts are bouncing around the inside of my skull like a ping pong ball. Right, I can't. It doesn't stick. It's just, I got to do that. I got to worry about mowing the lawn, or I got to worry about, grabbing my kid's shoes, or whatever it is. And so, the point with that being that you've got to recognize when you're in those moments, and recognize in yourself, right, what's driving that, right, and then listening to yourself on like, what do you need past that, right? Because a lot of times we're so pre-built to like just push through. And just, let me get this thing done, and then I'll deal with, whatever I'm feeling, right? Because you got the adrenaline going, everything else, right? Depending on what you're doing, what task you're doing. But it's being able to stop and kind of check in with yourself, really. And I think that's where, not in like the counseling sense, right? But more so just taking that, that cognitive checklist, if you will, and going, all right, what's pulling at me right now? Why is it pulling at me? Well, what am I doing with my thought process or whatever to either make this better or make it worse, right? Because it goes back to that internal mental model. Because it's not only within those handoffs that you have to worry about it, you have to worry about it yourself too. And go, what internal model am I holding on to right now that maybe isn't valid anymore? That maybe, I'm worried about XYZ, but I got ABC at my door, right? And I got to deal with that, and maybe the XYZ thing isn't even a factor anymore. Right? And so exactly like you hit on earlier, it turns into a change of thinking and a change of how we evaluate ourselves, and recognizing when that cognition is degraded, when those pieces are lapsing, when you just feel that internal pressure, on your skull or whatnot, that's like, oh my gosh, what is going on? That's the time for me that I've really went, okay, hold on, I got to step back. And, and then maybe reflect on it, right? Maybe, hey, let me work through, that's a cool thing with AI, right? You can turn it in to be like, hey, I'm thinking about this, blah, 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 blah. Is this thought process legit or not, right? And I'm not saying, you turn it into your own personal therapist, but it's good for sanity checking yourself, especially in those moments when maybe that line or that direction forward isn't as clear.
Sure, that self-evaluation and iteration around it. I
Absolutely.
definitely have that as one of my most important principles as well that I try to walk through life with.
Absolutely.
Um, Now, when you transitioned out of that role, thousands of hours instructor evaluator rating. I mean, you got a very impressive background.
Thank you.
Was there any single system that could really verify all of that to a civilian employer when you were trying to make that transition out, or did you have to kind of reprove everything from scratch and say a resume line that nobody else could in the community could read?
Yeah, I can tell you it's definitely a challenge, right? Unless you go to like a 1-to-1 where I'm going from like Air Force to General Atomics, right? Something like that where it's a pretty much a 1-to-1 swap, right? I swap a flight suit for a polo, and that's all that really changes in my day to day. But past that, right? I think the hardest thing is recognizing there's so much more to what we were doing, than just and anybody in the community will understand this reference, than just put the thing on the thing. Right, that was essentially meant, hey, just put the crosshairs where they need to go. Shut up and color and just do the thing. And it was like, yeah, thanks, but there's a lot more that goes into it than that. Right, and so it's understanding, for yourself and really reflecting on, cognitively. There's a lot of challenges that we navigated around. There's a lot of really good processes, right, that we created, manifested. I mean, we most of our tactics were built by fighter pilots, with it, and the U.S. Air Force Weapons School was almost there was essentially a weapons school patch in every single unit that drove the tactics for that unit. They were kind of that final authority, for how the aircraft was employed. So it's looking at some of those day-to-day pieces and realizing, while none of those frameworks are going to transfer anymore, right? When I'm trying to like change a diaper or make a sandwich or whatever, right? But it's understanding that there's good things that came out of that, and there's exceptionally efficient and effective methods that we did and conducted during those times that can transfer. And that's the stuff that like I'm trying to really put words to now, is what does that look like, right? And so I work a lot within the remote warrior community, because we have like our own Discord of 150 plus members, and just really trying to drive that discussion, because it's a point that a lot of people, unfortunately, when they get out, they cheapen what they did, and they don't understand truly the cognitive effects, both good and bad, right, that we had, to operate at that time. And it makes you really, really good in other areas, and there's parallels with engineering, there's parallels with obviously aviation, but not only that, law enforcement, crisis management, right? All these things that you feel internally like, oh, when something happens and then everything gets real quiet, right? When you're in the middle of a crisis, everything around you gets real quiet, and you just feel like you're moving slow, and you got the you can just almost be a conductor and orchestrate in those environments, and that's a strength, right? It's just that you've got to practice where to put that. You got to practice what bucket to put that stuff into on the outside, so that way, oh, by the way, when I'm going to target and I've got some like two people in front of me that all of a sudden I'm like, I can't get in past, and my brain's like, but I really need the Minute Maid of rice that's on the other side of them, right? And then I'm freaking out internally because that's the quickest way to get there, but I don't want to walk all the way around, right? With it, because my brain is just trying to squeeze efficiency out of everything I'm doing, and there's a time and a place for it, right? And when I'm at Target shopping, probably isn't the place for it, there, but it's going to take that repetition, right? It's where like things like exposure therapy and stuff like that, I think, does have validity in that. It's just not in the traditional methods. And so I think that's the biggest piece, is there's a lot when it comes to, again, circling back up to that mental health side of this, that these lessons can be taken and driven forward, but it's going to take the community to recognize as a whole where those processes live and how to properly put them in place on the other side. And that way your brain's not just trying to do it at random times, and you're like, what in the heck was that? Why did I just calculate all this stuff when I'm just running 2 miles down the road to a gas station to fill up with a tank of gas that I know is half full? Who cares? All the calculations up to that point. But it's that kind of thinking and that kind of procedures that it's like, maybe I can put this in somewhere else, and put these efficiencies and this need for efficiency into a different avenue, a different approach, a different manner to truly then benefit my brain instead of trying to fight it all the time because it's just trying to search for it constantly.
Understood. Now that really showcases the need from a perspective that originally, from an operational standpoint, you almost have to take that like "fuck your feelings" type
Mm-hmm.
mentality. It's straight logistical value,
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you need to put in place to actually have something work out. So, but then as you go into that experiential level of a civilian life, and really how that transitions, you almost have to add those emotions back into
Mm-hmm.
that exact logistical thinking. So,
Absolutely.
it's definitely an interesting caveat as you're going into that next mission or that next stage of things, because the mission may not necessarily be to put the crosshairs on a target, but how do you end up going to target to
Yes.
actually get a set of items that you're looking for. So
Absolutely.
understood. Now, what's say one lesson from your generation, aside from because we've talked very heavily about, say, that mental health and that
Mm-hmm.
cognitive mental model here, that you're worried kind of gets lost if nobody codifies it before the people who lived it move on from that. Because you've obviously walked through a few different transition areas where it comes into that operational readiness side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, aside from the cognitive side of things here, what's one thing that your generation of operators, or that you're worried gets lost if nobody ends up putting that into practice for the next stage?
I mean, I think that question kind of encompasses a lot of this whole discussion, right? Is
Sure.
realizing that what we we were put into environments that were very challenging, right? Very unique, right? That there's there's so many good things that came out of that, and there's so many good underlying processes that come out of that, that being able to again communicate them, talk about them, capture them, right, and recognize those lessons learned, um, across this can have these good effects across other industries, across other pieces here, because it was really the very first long-term operation of supervisory control, right? And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. I think there's a lot of areas that can really be broken down. It's just a lens that I don't think the typical human factors specialist, psychologist, you name it, is looking at it through that lens. And so I think there's a lot left on the table, per se, for this field, and where what we can take from it, what we can learn from it. And that's the piece where the more that we as operators coming from that field share our experience, talk about it with each other, with others, things like that. um, it'll do good for a lot more than just us.
Understood. Knowing everything you know now, would you do it again?
This is an internal struggle, as you can see. I would. I would, and because somebody's got to, right? Somebody's got to advance it. Somebody's got to think about this stuff. Somebody's got to talk about this stuff, because we've lost too many people to suicide and things like that, that were misunderstood, that don't get the recognition they deserve, that don't get the respect that they deserved for the operations. And so I'm thankful that I have an insanely good support system. I have friends that I talk to almost daily, and I've got an incredible family, an incredible wife that has pushed through all this with me. And it's been rough. It's been ups and downs and different things there, and it's been a lot of hitting walls on where older frameworks that I'm trying to push up against start breaking, and that gets frustrating with it. But absolutely, because like I said, at the end of the day, somebody's got to try to capture this, right? And that's the thing. I'll be the first person to admit I suck at articulating certain things and getting information out there and doing it the quote unquote right way, right? I'm more of a just cannon fodder, shotgun it, and boom, right? It's to get all that info out there, but it's one that, even within that, it's just trying to be that 1% better every single day. Not 100%, right? Because that's stupid. I hate when people say that. It's 1%. It's what little thing did I do yesterday? Could I do 1% better today? And if I keep doing that every day, after a month, after a year, after 10 years, life gets pretty cool at that point. So I absolutely would do it again because, one, at the end of the day, I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of the work I did. It was one of the coolest jobs to do as a 19-year-old, to have a JTAC on the other line being like, yo, aircraft call sign, appreciate you guys, thanks for the heads up out there. And I remember hearing that for the first time at 19, and I was just like, this is fucking cool. To be that tip of the spear, to be making that big of an impact, to go home and see on CNN and things like that it's like drone strike here, and I'm like, that was me. That's weird. It's you really got to see, the impacts of the work. It's just that it needs to be taken more seriously, and it needs to be understood better, and the operators themselves just need to be flipping listened to, because the amount of people that I talk with a lot of people about this, that think they have it figured out, think they know what it was like, think they have the answer. It's like, please stop. You don't. Not even close. And it's not comparative to any other thing, right? I'll never compare it to boots on the ground. But it sure as hell wasn't an office job, sure. When it comes down to it. And so, like anything, we need to do those deep dives and understand how it's changing and how it's influencing those operators, not only to better them, but to better the future of those operators too.
Understood. I appreciate you walking through that.
Of course.
It's very it's one of the most respectable careers that you could ever be a part of, and
I think so too.
Having that support system behind you is very important too, and I definitely hold close to me that compound effect mentality, that 1% better every day.
Absolutely.
There's always something that's going to come up. So just having the ability to work through it and to see kind of what that next level can look like for us, I think is very important as we walk through it. So genuinely, Tanner, thank you again for going there.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd want to leave the people that are listening to take away from your time in that seat? Is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
I think we kind of covered it all, right, at this point. I honestly do. It's just one that it's a very unique operation. It's got very unique, things that it's doing to you cognitively. And I think it's an untapped resource for a lot of industries driving forward. And the cool thing is, if we do that right, then we stop having veteran suicides in this career field. And we get people that get to be understood, which is an important part.
Absolutely. So we covered all four of what you told me really matters here, that human side, technology, really the responsibility, and then that transition. That was the whole episode here, and the piece that really sticks with me is that cognitive overload at certain points, and really how important it is to have a support basis behind you. So really, I know you run Remote Warrior, supporting drone veterans. If this conversation moved you at all, and that's where you put your energy, Tanner, where should people find you and the organization at?
Yeah, absolutely. We got socials. We get social media pages across every major social. LinkedIn and Facebook are our most active with Remote Warrior LLC. We also have the rwportal.org. It's currently going through a little bit of a revamp right now, but that's really going to house not only the advocacy work, because that'll always stay foundational to why I built Remote Warrior and the whole driving force behind it. But I also am using it as a tool to educate, the general public on where have UAS gone in the world, right? How did they even start, right? Because it wasn't this. It's not. I promise you, it's not this new thing that just popped up in the last 30 years. It goes back far, far, far before that. So being able to preserve that, like we talked about, is the main piece there. And that's really the kind of, I'm hoping by the end of the year we can get into a really good, clean way to present that information. So that way anybody that is, even if it's not, the big ones up here, It's the, even if they're trying to learn about the small ones, we can have some resources to educate them, because at the end of the day, I think one of the coolest things ever is watching a light bulb go off on top of somebody's head. And so that's what I'm always going to keep doing. It's just keep educating and keep driving forward with it, and that 1% better every day.
My man. So this has been C-Suite Standards. If this episode meant something to you, follow the show and share it with one person who needs to hear it. Tanner Yackley, thank you again for everything. Looking forward to see exactly how we walk into the future together.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you so much for your time.
You too. Appreciate it.